I did. When I was taking the trip, I was going to bring a really beautiful copy of Thomas the Rhymer, the first edition hardcover, and present it to Linda, and I forgot it. And then I also forgot to bring a paperback to read from. Fortunately, very fortunately indeed, Adam Zolkover gave a terrific talk about Thomas on Monday morning. No, whatever, day one morning, and happened to have a copy on hand, so I'm very grateful. And then tonight, I was going to bring the Swords Point T-shirt from Lithographs that I did wear to the thing on first day morning. Again, sort of whip it out of my bag and show it to you, but I forgot. But it's the entire text of the novel on a T-shirt. Yes. And they've just started infinity scarves too, which are like the new cool thing. And it's possible, it is in fact entirely probable that you can use $5 off code St. Veer on the infinity scarves as well as the bags and the T-shirts and the room posters. And if they made a shower curtain, I would be so happy, but so far, no. Like, that's what you need in your bathroom, right? Is an entire novel on your shower curtain. I don't understand their resistance. But anyway, so I didn't bring quite enough of these, but either take one or photograph it, because this is the 21st century. That's my commercial announcement. And now I will step down, and it will be as if I had never been here.
If I can just make a plug for the infinity scarves, they're really cool.
Louder. I don't think everyone heard you.
If I can make a plug for the infinity scarves, they're really cool.
You should make the point from the
I think I will not do that from the microphone. However, sorry, you're going to have to adjust this again. I'm short. Welcome, everyone, to the Stith Thompson and Phillips Berry Lecture. My name is Linda Lee, and I am one of the co-conveners of the Folk Narrative section. We are really excited to have you all here, and also really excited to have Ellen here, who I will formally introduce in just a moment. But the lecture this year is co-sponsored by the Folk Narrative section and also the Music and Song section.
Yay!
And I would strongly encourage you, if you are not already a member of either of these sections, to please go ahead and join these sections. This year's lecture is also made possible with support from two additional sections, the creative writing section and the folklore and literature section. We've got some folks from...
We're now the creative writing and storytelling section.
Yay! Thank
So
you
the
for
creative
recognizing
writing-
there's a difference.
And so if these are topics that interest you, I strongly encourage you to join the sections and also to become dues-paying members of the sections, which allows us to be able to have really great events like this. So that's one of the things that your dues go to. It is my very, very great pleasure to introduce Ellen Kushner. She is a writer, a radio host, a teacher, a performer, and a public speaker. We're going to get to enjoy some of all of that tonight, possibly not radio.
Wait, no, we have broadcast.
Fair enough, yes, there's a broadcast. She's obviously a very talented woman who wears many, many, many hats, although not today.
I forgot my hat.
She's the author, as was mentioned moments ago, of Thomas the Rhymer and several novels in her Riverside series, including Swords Point, the novel that launched the manor punk fantasy subgenre, and also Privilege of the Sword and The Fall of the Kings, which she co-wrote with her wife Delia Sherman. She's narrated the Riverside series in the Neil Gaiman Presents series on Audible, and if you enjoy listening to audiobooks, I strongly recommend that you check those out. They are wonderful. And the second season of Tremontaine just launched. That is a multi-author prequel to the Riverside series. And I think there's more information about that up here. And she's also the founder and past president of the Interstitial Arts Association, Foundation, excuse me. And like I said, it's my very great pleasure to introduce her and look forward to her talk, the title of which I do not have in front of me. Oh wait,
I do.
it's right here. No, it's not there.
Wait, I've got it here.
Thank you. That was the one piece of information I didn't put on here. And the title of her talk is Rewriting Thomas the Rhymer, A Fantasy Writer Finds Truth and a foolproof plot in folklore. Thank you.
I'd like to hear a slightly more sincere applause for Linda Lee, because it is entirely due to her persuasion that I am here at all. When I got this letter from her saying, please come give the Stith Thompson lecture at the American Folklore Society, I freaked out. Because I actually know who Stith Thompson is. And I said, I am unworthy, because I thought it was a lecture to the entire society. And I thought, oh, I'm so bogus. Like, I love folklore, and I am not an academic at all. But Linda cheered me up by saying, I have 2 sets of notes here, by the way. You're not supposed to be the sage on the stage. Just, speak from your own experience. And I love that, the sage on the stage. I am not the sage on the stage. I am the fool on the hill. Because I really write very much out of my subconscious, which is why I got such a kick on day 1 morning from hearing 3 of the members of the folk narrative section give papers on my work. I would like to, okay, you have to understand that I have 4 sets of notes here, and the best, which is the one Linda gets all the credit for, was, so back to story number 1. I know I jump around a little bit, but in the end I always come back. So Linda said, well, I'll meet you at the IAFA in Fort Lauderdale, which is the international conference on the international help me out here.
International Conference of Fantastic in the Arts.
Sing it. And all will be revealed. So we had this fabulous conversation in which we basically roughed out everything I was going to say on the back of 2 spare Swords Point t-shirt coupons, which you can't have because they have all my notes on them. So why do I know who Stith Thompson is? It's because I really wanted to be a folklorist. I really did. And in college, well, I went to 2 colleges, one of which I share with Caroline Dinshaw. I was really impressed with her talk yesterday and with her in general. And she had the audacity to drop the name Thomas the Rhymer. Although not being as intimate with him as I am, she called him Thomas Rhymer. And I thought, oh, geez, that's like saying, Sam Delaney for Samuel R. Delaney. But in fact, it's Chip. But anyway, and I'm sorry, if you don't know who Samuel R. Delaney is, you're still okay. He's a big science fiction writer and intellectual, a man very much to be admired, and he looks like Santa Claus, So, anyway, I started off at Bryn Mawr, and then I did a sharp left turn and ended up at Barnard, and I majored in something incredibly nebulous called Program in the Arts. But in fact, when I looked back over all the courses I took and the papers I wrote for them, I realized that I had constructed my own folklore major. Years later, I figured this out, that every single course I took, I would write about the folklore of X, sociology, the folklore of sociology. I really did. It's very funny, and it's clear that that's where my passions were. My passion for the source material for Thomas the Rhymer in particular comes to me through song. When I was a teenager, my father just kind of kept bringing things into the house to see if anybody would be interested in them. And he got this Ewan MacColl record. Can I get a look of immense confusion or some nods of yes for MacColl? So Ewan MacColl was a marvelous British musician and really folklorist who hung out with the traveling people of Scotland, collected a lot of their songs. Just the list goes on and on. Look him up if you're not familiar with him and his work, or just ask our friend here to tell you all about him. And he sang in this very traditional, unaccompanied singing style, which was abhorrent to anybody who's grown up in the modern world of electronics and highly orchestrated or studio recorded songs. And instead you get this guy going, "True Thomas lay on Huntley Bag," and it was horrible. But the songs that he was singing on that album, I really resonated to because they were about my passions for, Elfland and the olden days. I was very, very big on the olden days. I was fascinated by history and just the sense that the numinous and the mythic really did exist in our own world. So I stuck it out, and just like when your mom makes you have a bite of something that you think you don't like, and you're forced to have one bite every time it's served, even though you hate it, hate it, hate it, after about a month, you'll find it's not as horrible as you thought it was. So I really fell in love with McCall and started seeking out other recorded traditional singers, in addition to the stuff that was popular in my day, which was, kind of chewed and studio-produced gorgeous stuff by people like Pentangle, Steel Eye Span, all that. So I became saturated with balladry, folk balladry. I love to sing, and I love to listen to music. But the way that I encountered Thomas was actually not through a recording. It was through that section in the poetry book collections between Chaucer and Shakespeare called Anonymous. And they always had some ballads in there. And to be fair, my best friend at the time was in high school, was obsessed with Thomas. So I think she's the one who, we talked about it a lot, Thomas the Rhymer. And I'm gonna pause here actually and say, just give me a little high sign if you're not familiar with the book and the story. Okay, I will adjust my course then to make that clear. Why don't I do this? So much of what this talk, although not all, will be about is my relationship with Thomas the Rhymer, both as folklore and as subsequently a novel. And then we'll break it down and talk about other things as well. It's the story of a man who meets the Queen of Elfland on a hillside and is bound to her for 7 years to serve her in Elfland before he can return to his own country. And during that time, he's not allowed to speak. And it's been made clear that he is a harper and a poet, and to deny a voice to a person who is essentially a performer is a very tough thing. The ballad, which is considered Scottish, but it's a border ballad between the border between England and Scotland that is a kind of a nebulous border zone, much like the Mexican-American border, only Scottish and English. So it comes from that culture, and it does not tell you what happens to him while he's in Elfland. He just pops back up again one day. So that's a lot of material for a novelist to get to play with. I had no intention of writing the novel of Thomas the Rhymer, because to me it was the great, great subject. It was the poet's King Arthur. He was our guy. He's the guy who actually goes to the source of all story and returns with the Queen of Elfland's gift of being able to speak only truth. Now think about that for a second, if you will. What does that mean, to speak only truth? She says literally, I'll give you the tongue that cannot lie. Okay, and just come with me to bookland rather than to what you as folklorists know it supposedly meant, and just open yourselves wide up. It could mean that you know things that nobody else knows. It could mean that you have integrity, or it could mean that you're absolutely stuck with sounding like an idiot every time you open your mouth because you can't do social lying, you can't do anything at all. So that, again, is just very fertile stuff. And I remember sitting with another young writer in New York, Lisa Tuttle, who's gone on to do great things, and we bonded over the fact that we both loved Thomas. And I remember saying, someday I want to write about that. Thinking, someday when I'm old and wise. What happened instead was that my friend Terry Windling, who's also a terrific folklorist in her own right, but was an editor at the time, was putting together a series of novels based on ballads. And I said, if you give anybody else Thomas, because I realized suddenly that my prize was going to be snatched from my grasp. If you give anyone else Thomas, I'll never speak to you again. And she looked a little pale and said, I actually already gave it to somebody, but I'll see if they'll give it back. And to my delight, they did. And so I wrote this, thinking it would just be some little, toss-away paperback that would get published in this little series. And the series folded, and I still had the novel, so my agent took it and presented it as my second novel after Swords Point. I found finally, I've heard a lot of very, to me, very unsatisfying song renditions of this, musical renditions on recordings, and I hate them all. I like it unaccompanied, and I like the original tune, which is this. True Thomas lay on Huntley bank, a fairly he spied was he, and there he saw a lady bright come riding down by the Eildon tree. Her gown was of the grass-green silk, her mantle o' the velvet fine, an elkatet of her horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. True Thomas he took off his cap and louted low down at the knee, all hail, thou mighty Queen of Heaven, for thy peer on earth I did never see. Oh no, Thomas, she says, that name does not belong to me. I am but the Queen of fair Elfland, am hither come to visit thee. Oh, harp and carp, Thomas, she says, oh, harp and carp along o' me, but if you dare to kiss my lips, sure of your body I shall be. Betide me weal, betide me woe, that weird'll never daunt in me. Then he has kissed her ruby lips, all underneath the Eildon tree. Now you mun go with me, True Thomas, you mun go with me, and you mun serve me 7 years, through weal or woe as chance may be. But Thomas, ye mun hold your tongue, whatever ye may do or see, so if you speak word in elven land, you'll never come back to your own country. So that's the setup. And I poured all my love of ballads and all the ballads that I knew into the novel. Every time I needed a plot device, every time I needed somebody to refer to something, I always used a ballad. Sometimes they were ones I actually knew from having heard them recorded, and sometimes they were ones I'd read in the wonderful 5-volume of James Francis Child, who collected every ballad that had ever been written down in late 19th, early 20th century. So the Child ballads were a terrific source for me, and they were some of my favorite bedtime reading. So that is the genesis of the novel. I'd like to skip over to something that may seem like I'm switching tracks, but I'm not, which is, and a bad radio person, I forgot to check the pronunciation. Is it Jenna Jorgensen? Gina Jorgensen. Okay, thank you. So Gina was one of the 3 people who did a presentation on my work, and on day 1, and hers was called Myth, Ritual, Theory, and Application, The Functions of Folk Narrative in the Fall of the Kings, which is the novel that I wrote with my wife, Delia Sherman, the Mad Knitter over there. And I'm doing it partly because I am not a scholar, as I believe I pointed out earlier, and I do things very intuitively. But hearing, it always takes somebody else telling me what I did, and then I'll go, oh, yes, well, I guess I did do that. So I was just fascinated with the way she sort of broke down the Fall of the Kings, and between hearing her piece and hearing Linda Lee's piece on narrative logic in The Privilege of the Sword, which is one of the Riverside stories, and Adam Zolkover, I was sort of absolutely stunned when he got going on Thomas and making time in Elfland, the quality of inevitability in Ellen Kushner's Thomas the Rhymer. So I'm not even sure I know what I heard him say, except that I kind of sat there with my mouth open. But the 3 of them revealed things to me about how much folklore and folk themes run underneath every book that I do, not just Thomas. Linda told me some of this at ICFA, and I just sat there with my mouth open, taking notes, going, well, I didn't know that. So I'll just use this handily written paragraph by Gina. In their novel, The Fall of the Kings, Ellen Kushner and Delia Sherman portray scholars unearthing a centuries-old covenant between kings and wizards. Inadvertently dabbling in magic that no one thought existed, these characters enact myth ritual theory while simultaneously engaging with other folk narrative genres. Changing legends, pick up. This is the radio part. Changeling legends, fairy tale imagery, personal narratives, and family folklore intermingle in this fantastic setting. These examples of folklore function to provide a contrast between lore that is assumed to be false and is simply part of the setting's backdrop, and the actually true historical lore about magic and kings. These strategic uses of folk narrative also unsettle and interrogate norms of gender and sexuality, poking at the entanglement of story and society. In this paper, I shall describe how using a folklore in literature approach to this novel needs to take into account the perceived truth value of the folklore in question, analyze said folklore from the vantage point of myth ritual theory, and discuss the eroticization of men's bodies and brains in what I've been calling a sort of scholar porn. And there you have it all, really. That's the novel in a nutshell. In The Fall of the Kings, which, while not the third book published in the Riverside series, is the third book chronologically in the lives of the characters and takes place about 60 years after Sword's Point, Delia and I really hunkered down to get into what are the myths of this world. And the question that we asked ourselves was, what are the myths and the history that would create a society that is the Society of Swords Point? Most of this was Delia's obsession because she has a PhD and has that kind of scholarly and historiographical historiographical turn of mind. And she made me do it, but it was a lot of fun. But the other thing that was going on at the time was that I was doing my public radio series, Sound and Spirit, which ran from about 1996 to 2006 on various radio stations around the country, public radio stations, and was my attempt, as I put it, to, I can't believe I've forgotten this line, I said it so many times, age is a cruel master, to look at, well, what I was really doing, aside from the cute radio line, was I was trying to look at the axes of cultures and beliefs through time, and cultures and beliefs around the world and through the ages. That was it. And anything was game. It was half music and half spoken word. And every week I would pick a different theme. And I'm not trying to torture you. There were actually about 100 of these highly produced shows that my station, WGBH, my producing station, kept on their website. So if you go to ellenkushner.com and click through some links on audio, you can hear about 100 of these, should you so desire. So I was very much involved in the question of myth and music and how they engage with, express, solve every single human issue. And they do, of course they do. This turned me into a raving generalist, which was very interesting. But anyway, I was working on that, and so it seemed very natural to work that into The Fall of the Kings. Our line, and I was on the radio, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be a giant superstar, just like Garrison Keillor, and everyone's going to buy my book. And instead what I usually got was people reviewing it on Amazon going, it's hard to believe that nice Ellen Kushner wrote this extremely racy and naughty book. But what we were trying to do, our tagline when I went to other public radio stations saying, hey, how'd you like to interview me? Host of Sound and Spirit, just wrote this novel. Yes, it looks like a fantasy novel, but really what it's about is about how when cultures try to turn their backs on their past and their mythology, it comes up and bites them on the butt, was the elegant way that I put it. But in fact, it really is true. And Gina, in her piece, did not miss the fact that what I'm basically talking about in a world of cloaks and swords is a modern world, or at least a world that considers itself modern and to be well beyond myth and folklore. And that stuff is all nonsense, and we don't believe in that. So I would absolutely not say that it's an allegory, but it certainly is something that means something to Delia and me and that we really wanted to engage with. And we deliberately grayed out what the truth was, being modernists ourselves, that nobody's actually right. We even tried to make it seem as though the magic might or might not be real, might or might not be delusional. The people who are jumping around saying, yes, yes, the kings must return and the old land must be preserved to its old days, they're kind of assholes. And so you can sort of decide where you want to jump in on this, or you can just observe it from a little bit of a distance, as Delia and I do, with a whole lot of love and a sense that everything's up for grabs. One of the things that I learned from talking to Linda Lee at ICFA was that I thought my inspiration for the Riverside books was Dorothy Dunnett, who I read at a formative age at the same time that I started reading Georgette Hare. You may know neither of these authors, and it doesn't matter, but they're both mid-20th century authors, and they both kind of hit me like lightning. They're both genre authors, and they're better than almost anybody else writing today. They're both sadly dead. And when, in fact, Dunnett died about 10 years ago, and I really felt as though a person I had been in conversation with was no longer there for the conversation to happen. But when I talked to Linda, I realized how much everything I write, not just Thomas, is in conversation with folk and fairy tale themes. You know, the stuff that hits you when you're young is the stuff that really stays with you. And she did a terrific piece on that yesterday, and you can ask her if you can read it. She said it's grounded in central motifs of heroes and quests and testing and who's the true prince and who's the monster bridegroom. And all these things are true, but the lovely thing about being a contemporary novelist is that you can subvert everything. And I do that very deliberately. For instance, in Swords Point at the beginning, that was my first novel. And I was writing it at a time when heroics were the big thing, when people were still writing Tolkien imitations because they were still reading Tolkien. I was also influenced by Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and even by Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And I knew that what I was doing was very much out of the box, and nobody was going to know what to do with it. Here was a fantasy novel that had no magic in it. Here was a society where everybody was queer in one way or another, and everybody was evil in one way or another. My friend, the writer Caroline Stevermer, referred to the main characters as sunlit villains. And so at the beginning, I wrote this very elegant kind of scene-setting, beginning of the movie feel to it. The snow is falling and the windows are cracked and there's evil and there's going to be evil and there's going to be good. And people love that. And it says, let the fairy tale begin on a winter's morning with one drop of blood new fallen on the snow. And people get so into that they miss that you turn the page and it says, I almost have this memorized, but there is no evil lurking behind the windows. Everybody is pretty much what they are. And essentially, this is not going to be a fairy tale. But somehow the language, beware of seductive language, my friends. The language seduces people into thinking I mean it, and you have to be a better close reader to realize that I flip the whole thing on the second page and go, actually, no, none of that is going to be what happens. It's interesting to me that, and even I know I'm doing this, that all of my work attempts to subvert both genre and gender, which are spelled almost exactly the same. Coincidence? I don't know. But I think, again, that's what it is to be a true modern novelist, whether you're working in the fantasy field or not. I guess that sounds a little snotty, and I guess it is. But I very much dislike being put into categories. And I have tremendous, which is one reason I helped to found the Interstitial Arts Foundation, which is now going into its 10th year, I think, more than that. But I have a lot of respect for genre fiction. I think there is great, great work done in genre fiction. I think the best of it does relate to myth and the great root and source materials. And some of it's just plain fun, but it's very recognizably genre. And I'm amazed that I have any sort of career at all, because everything I do just goes, well, let's turn that on its ass. And yet, I like to think that part of what makes it appealing to genre readers is that I'm holding fast to the deepest truths. What Linda was talking about, the great stories are still the great stories. The trimmings can be changed. The other, let me wait for a moment and get back to something, and I wish I could remember whose piece it was on day one morning at 8 a.m., but I don't, that made me kind of sit up and go, oh, good heavens. It was about, somebody was talking about storytelling and how, Delia, you look sort of, do you remember? Okay, somebody was talking about storytelling and how there is a lot of storytelling in the world, and I know, I think it might have been Gina, because it was about how Tolkien creates that sense of a bigger world. God, I really sound like I'm patting my own back, don't I? I think somebody else should have been giving this lecture. But just think of me as a discoverer as much as you are. I just write this stuff. And usually, in fact, when people try to interview me and say, well, why do you think this and why do you think that? I go, I don't know, that's not my job. I write it. You figure out what it all means. I have no idea. But I am coming to it through knowing all of you, and I think that's partly what I'm trying to say here. So people are always coming up to me, particularly for the Riverside books, and going, oh, I know just what the clothes look like, or oh, I know just what this section of the city would be like. And I think, really? Because I didn't actually tell you. You're inferring it. And that is a writer's trick. If anybody here is also trying to trying to write fiction, or even trying to interpret fiction, art is illusion. There's a poem by, I think it's Alistair MacLeish, art being bartender is never drunk. It's my job, it's our job as novelists to make you feel that you're seeing all this stuff. And a lot of fantasy writers make up the whole world and have vast notes on it. And then they're very frustrated because they can't get it all into their novel, and they spend an awful lot of time telling you things that you don't really want to know. When I teach writing, I say it's like an iceberg. You got to have it all under the water, and then you just have a little bit of ice sticking up on top. It's fine if you know all that, but you really don't want to give it all to your readers, because that's not a story. That's an encyclopedia. So I just blithely fake it. I just make stuff up when I need it, but there's a part of me that knows that it's true. And weirdly enough, I'll just refer now to Tremontaine, the new series. This is a collaboratively written series that is online and takes place 15 years before the first Riverside novel, Swords Point. And I had to write the opening story for the whole thing, the pilot, as we call it, and I just got this conversation going between two characters who are, in fact, for those who've read Swords Point, Alec's grandparents. And you know from the novels that Alec's mother absolutely hates her parents, or hates her mother, and I never say why, because I didn't know why. But I was writing this conversation between the two of them, and I found out. And all I needed some lines, so I wrote some lines. And as I was writing it, I actually stood there and said, oh my God, that's it, that's why. So in some ways, I feel like it's just a big old iceberg I've got floating around in the sea of my subconscious. And it's there when I need it. The reason that I'm telling you this is there is a kind of a sea of story there, or a cauldron of story. And for me, it's just every experience that I've ever had, everything I've ever loved, goes into the great big soup pot, and then I dip it out when I want. And folklore is so much a part of that. And the fact that I think folklore is important means that I put a lot of folklore into the books, and I think that that is one of the ways that the books seem real to people, is because of that. So another example of my bizarre subconscious working in the mythic strain is the way that I open each section of Thomas the Rhymer. Thomas is narrated by 4 narrators, and each one gets roughly a quarter of the story to tell. And it was during a reading that I gave that I discovered something I had done. I have a performance piece that I do in which I sing ballads that either influenced or seem to me to be about what the book is. So I'll throw a couple of those in as well while we're skipping through the first 4 narrators. rattle and roar, and Willie, oh, he's gone to the fair for to sell his fiddle and buy some other ware. But parting from his fiddle, the salt dear blunt is he. Rattle and roar, and Willie, you're welcome hame to me. Oh, Willie, come sell your fiddle so fine. Willie, come sell your fiddle and buy a pint of wine. Were I to sell me fiddle, the world would think I was mad. Many's the rattle and roar and day that me fiddle and I have had. I'm not a teller of tales, not like the rhymer. My voice isn't smooth, nor my tongue quick. I know a few tunes, everyone does, but nothing like his. For me, you'll never hear songs of gentle maidens fording 7 rivers for their false lover so bittersweet as to make the hardest of old soldiers weep. Nor yet merry ones of rich misers tricked out of their gold with the twist of a word and a jest so neatly turned that the meanest old uncle that ever pinched a dowry still laughs without offense. Well, it's a power, surely, that music and those words, and I just haven't got it. This is Thomas. What songs do you sing to them in Elfland? There where all songs are true and all stories history. I have seen lovers walking in those glades with gentle hands and shining faces, their feet light upon the grass, where little flowers shone in the shadows as though the lovers trod the starry firmament. And some I almost recognized, Neve of the shining hair with Irish sheen, fair Aucassin with his gentle Nicolette, and 2 kingly men with their arms around one graceful Mary Queen. Other faces, other features, strangely arrayed, each one with their own story, no doubt, and now at peace with all stories done. Thomas returns from Elfland to the people who harbored him before he left. One of them is a woman named Meg, the wife of the first speaker. I don't like anyone to know that my hearing isn't as good as it used to be, but it's true for all that. There are other ways for a body to keep track of matters, though, and those I know. The start of the old dog by the fire, cautious but not alarmed as he made his way to the door, told me a friend was there, just before the knocking grew loud enough for me to hear it. And finally, the great love of Thomas's life, who's Elspeth. Little these days can make Thomas laugh, but there's an odd bit of news come up from the village, and I want him to hear it. Anybody want to take a shot at what I think is the same in all of those openings? To me, they were all people telling stories that comment on their ability to tell stories. In the end, I think that every fantasist invents a world that speaks their truth. I think you can do it deliberately, as C.S. Lewis did, or you can do it completely unconsciously, as I would argue Ursula Le Guin did for the first Earthsea book, A Wizard of Earthsea. The greatest fantasy, I think, is absolutely saturated with a person's true beliefs. What's the line in Huck Finn? It's hard to pray a lie. I think it's hard to lie a decent fantasy novel. I think there are people who do. I think there are people who try. I find fantasy novels that are clearly trying to tell me something the author would like to believe but doesn't necessarily truly believe are not always the best ones. And I think we can all be very tripped up by the things we truly believe making their way into our magic systems. There's a novel that I really want to finish, except that what it is actually saying about the world horrifies me. I wrote it in my 20s while I was trying to finish Swords Point and having trouble with it. And we all know what our 20s are like. And what it basically says is, when are you going to give up all this nonsense and settle down and get married? It's about a wizard and a king and their cousins. And the whole point of this fabulous narrative is that in the end you have to settle down and get married. I'm still trying to figure out how to subvert that, because it's a really good book. But the truth it was trying to tell is just unpalatable. Or maybe I'll do it and just let everybody deal with it. I don't know. This is why I like to not know what it is I'm really writing about. So looking back over this rambling narrative of my life and art as it connects to folklore, folklorists, and creation, as I was scribbling on my yellow pad, I came to the realization that from being a collector of folklore and wanting to be a collector and an analyzer, in short, wanting to be a folklorist, instead I became a person who created lore, particularly in the Riverside books, where I had an entire world to play in and could put into it whatever I thought meet and just or fun. And I guess enough of you have found that invented lore compelling enough to enjoy the books, want to read more, and most importantly, to have honored me with an invitation to give this lecture. Thank you very, very much. I'm always, it is, as promised, it's 8:45, and I'm always happiest when I can respond to questions rather than pull it out of the air. So I believe we have time for some of that.
We absolutely have time for questions.
Do you want to spell me? Or did you looked like you were going to get up and...
Well, I was going to get up and just, I mean, are you comfortable calling on people, or do you want
Yeah,
to?
I am. I'm fine,
Okay,
thank
then
you.
I'll just sit here and let you take
And if
care of
anybody
that.
needs to go off and get croned, I'm not looking. Oh, yes.
So my question about Thomas is, in that novel, there's another ballad which takes up a fair bit of the plot, actually, Famous Flower of Serving Men. And how did you come to incorporate that into the story of Thomas, and what were the connections there?
Well, there's a story about that. And let me just ask, for purposes of any webcasty stuff that's going on, do you need a questioner to be at the mic? At that mic?
We've stopped broadcasting.
Oh.
Because I ran out of stamina for standing.
Good, fine, good. Okay, all right, so anyway. Okay, so for those not familiar with either the novel or the ballad, Thomas goes to Elfland and then he reappears 7 years later. So that was the hardest part of the book for me to write, because I needed a plot. Like, what does happen to him while he's in Elfland? And I thought, aha, I shall draw the plot from another ballad. Which one will it be? There are so many, and they're all so good. Well, at that time, because Terry Windling, it's kind of a pedestrian answer, because Terry Windling was doing this potential paperback series of novels based on ballads, I thought I'd better not pick a ballad that somebody's going to want to write a novel about, because it would be such a shame if I, took a good one out of circulation. But wait a minute. My friend Delia Sherman just published, with Terry as an Ace Fantasy special, this novel that's based on the famous Flower of Serving Men, called Through a Brazen Mirror. And so nobody's going to be doing that one again, so I'll do that one. It's a great ballad, and I'll use that. So when I gave Delia the manuscript to read, she was a little taken aback and wrote me a famous letter. She wrote me a very kind and generous letter saying that it was like going into a house that you had lived in that suddenly had completely different furniture. Because Famous Flower is another one of these ones where a lot is left open to question. And the fact that it is known as a ballad at all is because Martin Carthy did the world's best recording of it. And he totally threw in a lot of verses that made it make sense, which turns out were done, I think, by A.L. Lloyd, right? People always think Carthy did it, but it was the great folklorist A.L. Lloyd who was so convinced, kind of like, what's his name, the Kalevala guy, yeah, L.S. Lindrut. And I believe that this is true, you know, that you can become so saturated with the material that you know you've got a direct heart line to it. I think that's what Tolkien was trying to do, too. And so you just write it down because you know it's got to be right. I actually did a story about Elias Lindrut, by the way. It's in Jonathan Strahan's, I forget what it's called, Witch's Cauldron anthology or something like that. I like Lindrut. I've got a lot of time for him because I'm real old-fashioned. So anyway, that's why. That's really, honest to God, the truth. I mean, it's not very sophisticated, but it's what happened. What? Yes? What? Just give me a topic, you know, anything. You know I can talk forever. Yes?
What's your writing process like?
Horrible. My writing process is horrible.
Your writing rituals or whatever. Like you sit down to write for a day, and what do you do to, or what's it kind of like?
Well, I'm a sprinter, really. I'm got the worst process in the universe, which is that I do things when they're due. I have a lot of trouble sitting down and focusing. I have no self-discipline. And what I really need to do is clear the time to do nothing but write and think about nothing but writing. And sometimes I go away. I actually leave town, go to a friend's house when they're out of town, and just go to a strange city and work. Otherwise, I simply curtail all of my social life and everything else and announce that I will be writing this week and everyone should more or less leave me alone. It's dreadful, but it is what I do. I don't recommend it. You can ask Delia. Hers is phenomenally good, and she gets much more done than I do. But I will tell you that every single writer around the world, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question because everybody has their own process. You have to find out what it is. You have to respect it. You have to try to figure out ways to make it work. Like for me, realizing I needed to literally leave town to go on a binge was extremely helpful to me. And now I know that that's what I have to do. So rather than being embarrassed about that or not doing it, I build in my writing binges. And trying to use someone else's process is death, because it adds a layer of guilt to everything else that's going wrong. But on the other hand, there is not a writer alive who has not at some point during their wanderings around trying to get the thing to work shouted very loudly at their spouse, "I hate my process." So there's no good process. It's all horrible. Yeah. Yes, in the delightful sweater.
So, do you feel this? I don't know if this is a leading question, but we have this sort of cauldron of story, and there's all kinds of creative people who draft things, who draw things out of this wealth of their source material. Do you feel that it is possible to betray that source material, or do you think that that material, if there's no moral value judgment associated, you can make a big blockbuster film that is big and dumb and glossy, and you could make some small, beautifully crafted work of literature, and those are equally valid interpretations of the cauldron story?
I've never thought about that. I think that's a judgment I'm not prepared to make. We're also opinionated, and we all have different opinions. And one thing that I have learned as a person in the arts over the years is that, de gustibus non disputandum est. What one man's meat is another man's poison. I can loathe a giant blockbuster, but it can mean everything to somebody else. So no, I don't think you can betray it. When you started to say that, I thought the thing that I do think, which is that the betrayal is when you're not true to it. I mean, if your personal wish, desire, and vision is the giant blockbuster, unless you're really doing it cynically, in which case I think it won't work. If there's a grain of heart and truth to it, it's a truth you're telling, and it's a truth that's going to communicate as truth to somebody else. I think if you don't hold fast to that and to your own true vision, oh God, I say this to the kids, they're all like 30 now. I know a lot of young writers at this point, and they're so frightened. I think it's either the internet or their parents or both. They're so afraid of getting it wrong. And now that there is this huge fantasy market where money can be made, and this huge YA market where money can be made, neither of which was really true for the fantasists of my generation. It kind of didn't matter. As long as you could get your book out there, you weren't gonna, be a millionaire. We just did it. Now that there are stakes and it's easy for people to find out what the rules are because there are all these communities online and all these rules that are always being posted, and depending on where you fall and how frightened you are, you're going to think that there are all these rules. And I see people, oh God, and I've had these lovely, lovely students at Hollins University where I teach in their summer master's program in children's lit, and they'll turn a beautiful, rare, original idea that they've had and go, but the market doesn't want that, so I'm going to make it this. It just breaks my heart. It really does. On the other hand, they may make a lot of money. They may. I mean, they may be right. And I've got editors who tell you to change it completely because it'll sell better, and they're probably right. It probably will. But what they're talking about is caviar to the general. They're talking about lowest common denominator stuff. All I can say is it's great. It's great to be a success, but will your book be read in 10 years, let alone 50? There's just a lot of different choices that are made by an artist all the time. Sure. Come on, feed me a line here. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite ballad that's not Thomas?
Ooh, kinda. Gee. Actually, I'm not sure I can answer that right now because they come and go for me. It's like, what am I currently singing or hearing in my head? What's a story I really love? I like suffering. I really like, is it The Loathly Worm? The one where the girl gets changed and her hair grew long, her breath grew strong. But it's the same when people say, what's your favorite fairy tale? I kind of have to dig deep to think about that. So I'm not sure I do. It depends on the mood. Depends on my mood. I'm changeable. I'm guessing that there are also people who want to ask questions but don't want to ask them in public, like to a great big room. Some people are shy. So why don't we do this, since we've got a little bit of time left? Let's just sit together in a corner somewhere and just schmooze, because let's just hang out, all right? Why don't we all go sit back there and just talk if you want to. Thanks for coming.